Thank you, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to this event, sponsored by the American Jewish Historical Society. My name is Melanie Myers. I'm the Deputy Director here, and we'd like to thank you all for attending. We are very pleased to host this talk for this brand new book, Marty Glickman, The Life of an American Jewish Sports Legend, written by Dr. Jeffrey Gurock of Yeshiva University. And we are also delighted to have with us today as moderator, Dr. Beth Wenger of the University of Pennsylvania. Both Drs. Wenger and Gurock have been longtime members of our academic council and just timeless supporters of AJHS, and it's wonderful to have both of them with us this evening. We'd like to remind the audience that there will be a Q&A near the end of the program. You should have been given note cards when you checked in at the desk, so please write your questions down, and there will be a prompt when it is time to pass them to staff members, and then they will be answered by our presenters. This evening's program will also be recorded and broadcast by JBS at a later date, so you will all receive an email when that is live and ready to be viewed. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Drs. Wenger and Gurock. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming.
It's great.
It's great to be with my good friend, Jeffrey Gurock. And I'll start the evening by telling you that everyone knows Jeffrey Gurock is a huge sports fan, New York sports fan, but maybe we have many actually connections other than being historians of American Jewry, but one of them is that I am also a sports fan, and often at the conferences that meet in June, we are one eye on the program and one eye on the NBA Finals.
And it's been awfully nice that when the men go to watch the NBA Finals, you join us.
Yes, I do.
You're one of us, and we're very happy to have you part of this group.
Well, we could talk about that too. But let's talk about the book. So, you know, there are lots of New York Jewish sports stories to tell. So I want to know, why this one? Why Marty Glickman?
So I'm going to celebrate my 74th birthday next week. And when I grew up in New York, and I sound like a New Yorker, as did Marty Glickman to a great extent, sports was a great part of my life. And when I played basketball in the street and I made a basket, I said, swish, because Marty Glickman said swish. Long before Marv Albert said yes, or Iron Eagle said book it, or Mike Breen said whatever he said, you know, bang, we had Marty Glickman. So Marty Glickman was part of my life. And I wanted in the book to evoke a very different era in sports history in New York City. For example, when we still had football teams in New York, Marty Glickman was the announcer first for the Giants and the Jets. And I remember as a kid, one time there was a game, and the game was very close near the end, and Marty Glickman said, we want the Giants to win. Open the windows to your tenements or your apartments and yell, go Giants, go, go Giants, go. And I did that as a kid. My father says, what in the world are you doing? I said, Marty Glickman told me to do it, so I'm doing it. The other story that's in the book, a friend of mine told me a story that he was driving on the Sawmill River Parkway one afternoon, on a Sunday afternoon. And again, the Giants were playing a game that was very, very close. 2-minute warning came up, and he said, if you're within the sound of my voice, pull off the road. I don't want to cause any accidents. And he said people were pulling off the road on the Sawmill River Parkway. Now, I thought he made it up until I found a memoir written by Mike Burke, who was the president of the Yankees later on, who said, I was driving on the Sawmill River Parkway and people pulled off the road. And then I interviewed a sportscaster who said he was driving on Flatbush Avenue in big traffic in the left lane, and Marty told us, pull off the road. And he weaved his way among 3 different lanes. That's how important Marty Glickman was. Those of you who are of my age will recall that until the 1960s, professional football games were not broadcast, the home games were not broadcast to us, hoping we'd go to the ball game. So I have an aunt and an uncle who lived in Yorktown Heights, New York. We would drive up 50 miles so we could pick up the Giants on Channel 3 from New Haven that watched the game. But we turned off the sound because we wanted to hear Marty Glickman broadcast the the radio version of the game. So all these things were ways of me trying to evoke for sports fans, people interested in sports history, what our life was when we rooted for Marty Glickman and for the teams that he backed and he supported. Or we'd say, I made a basket. It was good like Knicks. Needix. Needix was the terrible hot dog stand on 49th Street next to the Garden where people would hang out and interact with the bookies before they went upstairs to the balcony. And if you run into somebody of my age at a meeting who says, down in the front, it means they sat in the balcony of Madison Square Garden and they couldn't hear see what's going on. So all these things were part of my life, and I wanted to write about it as a sports historian. You know, kids played in the sandlot, like played football, and one of the fellows who's in the audience actually told me Marty Glickman would say he ran for a couple or 3 yards, and you could pretend you were Alex Webster of that ilk. That's half of my life, or a portion of my life. The other part of doing the book is, like Beth, I'm a serious scholar, and I see the metaphor of sports being very important in understanding the life of Jews in the United States. Perhaps if I was interested in the opera, I'd write about operatic figures. Perhaps I was interested in music, I do likewise. But sports is a very important element in the life of immigrant Jews and others. When I was at Columbia 50 years ago, I was privileged to study with a great African-American historian named Nathan Huggins. And he used to say, for minority groups, wars and sports are community-defining situations. If you're allowed to play for your home team, if you're allowed to fight for your country, it says a lot about where you are in the mind of the majority population. Now, as an African-American, the metaphor was Jackie Robinson, 1947, before Harry S. Truman, 1949, desegregated the armed forces. So the Glickman story fits that pattern, okay? It's not so much who wins the game, but whether you're allowed to play the game, whether you're part of the group. And Marty Glickman's story, particularly the story of 1936 and other incidences, is a way of studying the question of, do Jews fit in through the metaphor of sports? So it is a sports book, but most importantly, it's a book about American Jewish history, about the life of a young man who grows up in an ethnic cocoon in Brooklyn and tries to make it in America. And all the difficulties he had and all the triumphs he achieved, ultimately, that's why I wrote the book.
So I want to pick up on the last point you're making. You make a case in this book that, in fact, this is not just a sports story, that this is a way of seeing American Jewish history, and I'll say New York Jewish history. And so obviously this is a very exceptional individual life. How is his life, though, emblematic of New York Jews of this interwar period?
Well, I don't, in some respects, it's an exceptional life because he's a great athlete, and there was some very great athletes, but athleticism was not what the Jewish community was used to in these respects. But to a great extent, his life is a story of a second-generation Jew who grows up in an ethnic neighborhood. He's very comfortable where he is among Italians and Irish and Germans, no African Americans because it's a segregated city. And by the way, why did I turn to Beth Wenger to be the moderator? A, because she's a female jock, okay? But more importantly, my work is based upon things that she wrote about second-generation Jews during the Great Depression. I'll give you homework. There are 3 great books about this time period for New York Jewish history. One is the 1920s. My dear friend Deborah Dash Moore, At Home in America in the 1920s, about families moving from the Lower East Side to the Bronx and Brooklyn, and the Glickmans did that. The second book is New York Jews in the Great Depression, because something gets in the way. It's called the Great Depression in 1929, how we manage it. And the third book is a book that a lot of people don't reference, but I do, a book by Ronald Baylor called Neighbors in Conflict. All the battles between Jews, Irish, Italians, and Germans in New York before World War II. You will notice that Bayer does not talk about Latinos or African Americans because they're in a different category as far as the ethnic and racial groups in New York are concerned. So I was very concerned with telling the story of a guy who goes from James Madison High School, which was 90% Jewish, and he goes to Syracuse. He goes to Syracuse University. Why he goes is interesting. At a time where there were quotas against Jews in that school, and he's recruited to Syracuse by a group of fraternity brothers of the SAM, the SAMI fraternity, because they feel if we bring a great athlete up to Syracuse and he can score touchdowns and win races, that will make life better for all Jews. It's a quixotic dream that doesn't take place. He does very well at Syracuse. He's integrated, doesn't help the life of Jews generally. So people write about the experience of Jews and discrimination in quotas in these schools during the interwar period. So I'm using Marty Glickman to elaborate upon that and how a Jewish athlete could be, let me exhaust my knowledge of Latin, persona non grata honoris causa, namely, person who's not really wanted but honored because he could score touchdowns. It's another vista into the difficulties Jews faced during this time period. So, second generation male. By the way, when I studied James Madison High School, I actually went down to the high school and looked at the yearbooks. It's interesting how many of the men and women wanted to go to college at James Madison. Were they successful? It depends, but it's another piece of the story. I'm rambling on too much because I love the story so much, but the truth of the matter is you can use Marty Glickman as a way of telling a larger story based, to begin with, on the wonderful literature that Moore and Wenger and Bayer wrote, and then my own piece, throw the sports story in.
So I'm going to have to ask the historian's question now, which is about sources. Because what we do, we mine sources and we turn them into narrative. So the fact is, certainly growing up, I'm talking before especially the Olympics, and certainly before Glickman started speaking out about anti-Semitism, which we'll get to, much later in his life. But before that, as an historian, you really don't have a lot of sources, certainly in his own words. You have the local newspapers that covered the high school sports star, and you have, certainly the yearbooks and the high school stories. But how do you especially get someone's inner life and experience and read from those kinds of sources to construct a narrative of his early life?
Well, the first thing is it's important to have a great research assistant. And I had a wonderful research assistant, Ayelet Marder from Stern College for Women, who did a lot of the scut work for me. So I want to shout out to her. She did a wonderful job. Newspapers, New York Times. From the time the New York Times began to the present day, you type in Marty Glickman, you have hundreds and hundreds of articles about his experience. But there's more to that. Herald Tribune, until it folded, likewise. We looked at all the major newspapers. For sports fans, one of the things that comes up when he was in high school is that he played for the Brooklyn Public School Championship against Sid Luckman. You had Glickman and Luckman playing. They played at Ebbets Field in front of 20,000 fans. 20,000 fans. And the game was so big that if you went to the theater all over the country, There were newsreels which showed Marty Glickman and Sid Luckman playing ball against one another. So I had that source. By the way, if you're intrigued about these things, you can go to YouTube and you can see a game from 1968 that he broadcasted between Princeton against Columbia. Sports fans, Columbia had Hayward Dotson, Jim McMillan, Dave Newmark. Princeton had Jeff Petrie. Bill Bradley was already playing for the Knicks. So YouTube is helpful. Go to that. The best thing for me and the most fun for me is a chapter called Marty as Mentor. Many of the great announcers today were disciples of Marty Glickman, and I was privileged to interview many of them. Let me tell you how I did it. Once I get one guy, I get email addresses for others, and I send the following email. My name is Jeff Gurock. I'm a teacher at Yeshiva University. I have a contract to do this book, and then in big letters, I don't want any money from you. Will you speak to me? And so many of them spoke to me and wanted to tell me their experiences and how Marty helped them. The most intriguing interview, so I did Sal Marciano, Spencer Ross, Marv Albert, the list goes on and on, but the most interesting interview, the one I loved so much, was that I interviewed Bill Walton, the great basketball player.
Wow.
So I sent an email to Bill Walton. An hour later, oh, by the way, if 2 days go by and they don't respond to you, you're never going to get them. But they respond. An hour later, I get an email back for Bill Walton. I got to talk to you. Marty Glickman was the second most important person in my entire life. Why? Because Bill Walton stuttered and stammered as a kid. If you saw the HBO special recently, you know that he had this problem. Marty Glickman, as a youngster, also stammered and stuttered, and he took classes to improve his diction. So he worked with Bill Walton, and Walton today is a college basketball analyst. And the chapter ends with the following story. When Glickman died in 2001, one of the obituaries interviewed John Wooden, his coach, and they asked him, well, what do you think of Marty Glickman? He says, he was okay. Just okay? He says, yes. He taught Bill Walton to speak, and now Walton never shuts up. That's how the chapter ends. So, a combination of newspapers, YouTube, interviews, and Marty Glickman did 3 long memoirs, one that he published, one that he did for the American Jewish Committee, and one he did for the American Jewish Historical Society. So I read all 3 of them, and there were some contradictions in there. So I had to work with those different sources to get some sense of who Marty Glickman was, and that was very challenging. And using my own intuition and other sources. For example, in one of the memoirs, he says, Sid Luckman and I were close friends. The other 2, he says, I didn't like Luckman at all. So I had to nuance that, but the important thing was that they played against one another, and the New York newspaper said, Glickman versus Luckman, 2 Jewish players. That's how big high school football was during the 1930s. And one last thing, Beth, about high school football. Some of you may recall that Glickman did 2,000 games of all sorts, including professional wrestling, rodeo, and things of that sort. But you ask people of my age, when they think of Marty Glickman as their announcer, forget about yelling out the window and annoying my father. He did Saturday afternoon, Thanksgiving morning, high school football games, which a lot of people watched. And he loved New York. He sounded like a New York. He loved New York. And the reason he did it was, before he sat down for his turkey meal, let's say, that he wanted to tell New Yorkers during a period in the 50s and 60s where there were a lot of youth gangs in the city. Those of you who like music and theater West Side Story talks about some of that. And he wanted to indicate to New Yorkers there were a lot of damn good kids in New York. So at halftime, he'd interview the head of the Glee Club, the GO president, the newspaper writers, to tell New Yorkers all these wonderful things. So there's a crossover here, ladies and gentlemen. I look at him as a scholar, but I think I also love the guy retrospectively for all the things that he did as a New York announcer. And there is an American Jewish Historical Society connection to this just for one moment. I was chair of the academic council before Dr. Wenger succeeded me, and I was known by everybody as the sports guy among historians. She's the sports gal, I'm the sports guy. So the American Jewish Historical Society wanted to honor Marty Glickman towards the end of his life. So I was supposed to be the moderator, like she's the moderator tonight for me, and Marty was supposed to speak. And Marty didn't show up because he was too ill and he passed away later on. So my book is not a celebratory book, but in a sense, I believe that I'm saying to Marty somewhere retrospectively, here's what I would have said to you had you shown up in 2001. So I end the book by saying that his legacy lives on, and that's one of the things that made the book so important. Source material interesting, and that's my rationale for doing the book.
So I want to ask you about some of the more serious issues in the book, particularly what he became, I think, most known for people that didn't hear him on the radio all the time. The fact that he was an Olympic athlete in 1936 and sidelined by the American Olympic Committee. And you make a case, I mean, you tell us why he was silent at the time, later very outspoken about it, but silent at the time. And you make a case that this, too, is emblematic of American Jews of his era. And I just want to read 2 sentences about how you describe it. When people of his age group were confronted with opposition to their professional or social quests during the interwar and early post-war times within which they lived, they believed the best course of response was to find unobtrusive ways of dealing with their relegation to the margins of American life. So I want to ask you about drawing that conclusion from his silence and how you came to that conclusion.
So Marty Glickman, just for one of the things I want to say to begin with is, one of the things that troubles me is that so many people do not know about 1936 and what happened to him. And very few people know about, I'll mention his name, Avery Brundage. And what did someone say, boo, good,
yeah.
good. So Avery, I hope none of Brundage's relatives are in the audience tonight, but Avery Brundage, who was an American Nazi and spoke at German-American Bund rallies, was one of the people who helped sideline him. And I also want you to know that in 1972, when 11 Israeli athletes were murdered by Palestinian terrorists, he was the head of the International Olympic Committee and said the games must go on. By the way, and then I'll address this important question, there's an author named David Marinas, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, okay? And he did a biography of Jim Thorpe, the great Native American, I hope I'm using the right terminology, indigenous person, who was a great athlete. In 1912, he was instrumental in making sure that Jim Thorpe would lose his gold medals. So that's Avery Brundage, and he comes through the book a number of ways, and also in Marinas' book. So my sense of Glickman is, as you correctly point out, is that when Jews of that generation, and frankly, I spoke from this spot 2 weeks ago when we talked about Jews in response to fascism in America at that time period. And I made the point that you had activists who spoke out and who made a big deal about the anti-Semitism, but significant numbers of Jews said we have to move on and live our lives as best we can. And Marty Glickman said in his memoirs, I didn't want to make a big deal because I didn't think America wanted to hear my story. And his story isn't only about the 1936 Olympics, it's a story of other instances of anti-Semitism. And I think it's metaphorical for the way Jews saw themselves as outliers in America during this time period. As he gets older, and American Jews are more activistic, and they're more aware of what had taken place to our people in the 30s and 40s, he hooks up with the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and he travels the country with them to what he calls a prequel to the Holocaust. He was quick to say, nobody died in my experience, but this was the era, and now I want American Jews to know, and particularly young people, of what our people experience. So I defined him as an athlete, as a sportscaster, as an American Jew, and as ultimately a teacher. And towards the end of his life, he became Professor Marty Glickman at Fordham University, teaching sportscasting to another generation of fans and broadcasters. So I think it reflects the attitudes of American Jews during this time period. And by the way, this, after 1936, in August, right before his birthday, he's turned away. He comes back to New York, and he decides he wants to work out at the New York Athletic Club, which was off limits to Jews. He has a Gentile friend, they're going to work out. He gets to the door, and he finds out that the director says, Marty, you can't come in here because you're a Jew. And he's astounded that I'm an Olympian, and yet they feel this way. And it's only later in his life when he becomes a big shot, and the New York AC, which didn't allow women and didn't allow African Americans and didn't allow Jews, they've changed their tune, and they want him now to be honored by the New York Athletic Club, and he refuses. You know, he gives them the equivalent of the Bronx cheer, so to speak, and refuses to countenance this sort of thing. So I think it is the type of attitude. Oh, a personal story. In our home, growing up, we had what we called the purloined towel. My dad was a wrestler, as an amateur wrestler. By the way, he wrestled under an assumed name because he didn't want his mother to know he's becoming a bum and a wrestler. That's a different story. And one time, the 92nd Street Y, which was the Jewish Y, wrestled against the New York AC. And my father stole a towel from the New York AC because that's as close as Jews could get to that type of institution. So you learn a lot about American anti-Semitism of an individual as he moved within America. And one last story. How many of you know the name Esau Danilovich? That's Kirk Douglas. So many Jews changed their names because they couldn't make it within American society so long as they had a Jewish name. Pressure is placed on Marty Glickman to change his name to Marty Manning or Marty Mann so that he could be more accepted. And I compare it significantly with a second-generation American Jew who grew up in the Bronx, a woman named Beth Meyerson. You're Beth Meyerson in the Bronx and Marty Glickman in Brooklyn. There's a commonality. Pressure placed on Meyerson to change her name, and she says, if I win the Miss America contest, she's the only Jewish woman to win that contest, people won't know that I'm a Jew. I want people to know who I am. It's such an important story, and it's not a Jewish story only. Because when I interviewed Sal Marciano and told him that story, he says, interesting. When I started out and I grew up in Red Hook in Brooklyn, they wanted me to change my name away from being an Italian-American name, and I refused to do it. And then I became famous, and Marciano says, I ran into my childhood hero, Frank Sinatra, and Frank Sinatra said, you know, it's pretty great that you didn't change your name, that you're a proud Italian. So it bespeaks not only the Jewish experience, but the issue second-generation New Yorkers New Yorkers. Oh, one last thing. Among the people, I can go on for hours. One other thing, in terms of one of his goals, and this is really sad to me, he wanted to be a nationally recognized broadcaster. And when the BAA, the founding of the NBA, came into existence, he wanted to do the national game. And he was sidelined by the heads of the NBA. And one guy's name was Maurice Podoloff, and the second guy's name was Haskell Cohen, two Jews who were petrified that Americans wouldn't want to hear Marty Manning with my wonderful New York dialect speaking to Peoria, Illinois. So these are some of the crises that he overcame. Very upbeat person, but in a very different world than the world of a man named Marvin Alfredick. Oh, that's Marv Albert, who changed his name not because of anti-Semitism, because how can you pronounce that name? Marv Albert is much easier. Tells you a different story about Jewish life in New York and America during this time period.
So I want to pick up on a different thread, which is about the intersection in his story between African American race and Jewishness. Because of course we all remember, or most Americans, if they remember 1936 in the Olympics, they remember Jesse Owens. And they remember, probably less, I think he always resented it, Ralph Metcalfe. But these were the two who replaced Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller in the Olympics.
And I'm glad you mentioned Sam Stoller, because he's the forgotten other Jew.
He's the other forgotten one in the story. And you make a point in the book of describing how that narrative was received in Germany and in the US, which, I welcome you to talk about. But I also want to think about this, because it's an interesting juxtaposition of, and I think also in how the histories have been told, because Jesse Owens is an icon very much in the way you described about sports being an important entryway for minoritized groups. I think that obviously Jesse Owens is that triumphal story for African Americans and was even seen at the time. But I want you to kind of think about how these two historical narratives coexist and how we should think about them.
Well, several things. When the track coaches come in and say the Germans have hiding these great athletes, so Stoller and Glickman, you're out, and Metcalfe and Owens, you're in. Jesse Owens gets up and says, I got 3 gold medals. I don't need a 4th. Let these boys run. And the coaches say, boy, sit down, which is the way people talked about African Americans and the way they talked to athletes back then. That's number one. Number two, with all the victories that he does for America, when the team comes back to New York, there is a parade down Fifth Avenue, and then there's a celebratory dinner at Waldorf Astoria. And Owens is honored as this great athlete. But to get to the ballroom, he's got to go up the freight elevator. Tells you a lot about how African Americans are perceived. And then I found an interesting nugget in a Syracuse newspaper from the fall of 1936. That's right after the Olympic experience. They talk about Marty Glickman going down to New Orleans for a track meet, and the writer says, we wish this white hope success in his endeavors. So wait a minute. He's now a white hope? The same Marty Glickman who a month earlier was sidelined because of his background, says you a lot about how Jews and African Americans are in a much lower status than Jews. Now think of Bayer's book, Jews, Italians, Germans, and Irish, but no blacks. And for Glickman, and he says this in all 3 memoirs, one of the saddest moments of his life was he had an African-American teammate on the football team at Syracuse. His name was Wilmette Singh, S-I-N-G-H, and he was a man of color, I think his mom was Indian from the subcontinent. His father was African American. And they're going to play a game against University of Maryland in a border state. And they tell Singh, you can't compete because the fans don't want to see an African American play on the football field. And Glickman writes several times, I was so hurt by what I didn't do. I didn't stand up and say, let Singh play, like Jesse Owens did for me. And it bothered him his entire life. He was very supportive of civil rights. I didn't mention this in the book. I ran out of room. But when John Carlos and, help me, Tommy Smith, right? When they raised their hands in protest, and most announcers were critical of him, of them, Marty Glickman was supportive of him. But look, Jews were marginalized, but African Americans were even more marginalized. And they had a good friendship throughout the years, but it bothered Glickman that he didn't stand up and be counted the way Owens attempted during this time period.
It's a very complicated story to tell, I think. I don't know if I have time for, oh, okay. So I'll ask one last question. So you mentioned how, I have so many more questions to ask, but okay. Maybe some people in the audience might ask them for me, because this is my chance to tell you before we wrap up that if you want to ask a question, there are note cards going around or that have gone around where you can write them down, and people are going to pass them up to me. So if you have something you want to ask, do that now. But as you're doing that, I might get two questions in. So I'm gonna cut you off maybe. The first question I want to ask is, so you didn't get to actually interview Marty Glickman in person, but if he were here in the front row, what would you say to him?
I would say to him that among the people he would most be proud of, among his disciples, was not a Jew, but a great announcer who's of Greek-American extraction. His name is Bob Costas. And Bob Costas did something which I want you all to know, and it's in the book. In 2012, 40 years after the murder of Israeli athletes, he's the anchor at the London Games of the Olympics for NBC television. And the Israeli national team and the London Jewish community asked the IOC to recognize the fact that 40 years had passed. And let me say as an editorial comment, the IOC has never been particularly favorable to Jews or Israel, but we could talk about that some other time, okay? So they wouldn't announce anything they wouldn't commemorate the activity. As the Israeli team marched in, he went off the script and said, ladies and gentlemen, I just want you to know who these people are and what happened to them 40 years ago. And then NBC went to a commercial. They cut him off after 10 seconds. It was a bit of a cause célèbre. So, Marty, if you're sitting here, you should be awfully proud of one of your guys stood up for Jews and said what needed to be said in 2012. And one other story. I got a million stories. One of the coaches who sidelined Glickman, his name was Dean Cromwell from the USC. And it was known in LA that he didn't like Jews, okay? So before the book came out, I sent a copy of The Galleys to a rabbi in Los Angeles who was asked to speak to the USC track club that was about to go to Auschwitz on a consciousness-raising tour. He took my book with him, and he told the story of Marty Glickman in 1936 and anti-Semitism, and they were enraptured by this. So, Marty, I would tell him today that Dean Cromwell has been replaced by a tolerant, understanding track club, and those players went to Auschwitz to learn about anti-Semitism and learn about the Holocaust. So, Marty, you're still a teacher, even though you're gone almost 25 years, And I tried to the best of my ability to bring your life into focus through this book. And that's why I enjoyed writing the book.
That's a good answer. So as I'm waiting for the note cards to come, I'm going to ask, even though I really would want to end on that note, I'm going to ask the small question that over email I asked him the other night. Kept him up at night, I think. So there's leave it to me, I'll find this very small thing in the book. There's a story he tells about his father being convicted for bankruptcy fraud when he was young, when Marty was young. And then later in the book, Jeff gets to talking about the basketball gambling scandals of the 50s, and he says, and this really resonated, I'm paraphrasing, resonated with Marty because of, what he carried with him about his father. And I said, I want to know more. What does that mean? Tell me more about what that means.
What I'm trying to say is that my alma mater, City College, in 1950, won the dual championship. They beat Kentucky and they beat other clubs. And it was a team of Jews and blacks playing together when that wasn't the case in this country. And the whole city was swept up with this. And there was such a degree of pride on the part of Jews, and to a lesser extent African Americans, that we had beaten Adolph Rupp. Adolph Rupp comes to New York to play against a team of Jews and blacks. And Marty is the announcer. And then in 51, there's this terrible basketball scandal at City College, and our alma mater never recovers from it basketball-wise. And I'm saying that two things. One, Marty Glickman says explicitly, I knew these guys. They came from the neighborhood. We had malted milks together. But I also suggest that early in his life, he had to deal with a moment of criminality, and he says we were not impoverished when my dad went to prison, but due to the efforts of my mother, listen, who left the workforce in the 1920s. Deborah Moore talks about that, but returns to the workforce in 1930s. Beth Wenger talks about that. She kept the family whole, and this was a very traumatic moment for him. And I'm suggesting, yes, I'm projecting something here. Okay, he doesn't say explicitly that I remember my father went to jail, although he does say my father came out of jail a broken man, he was never the same. But this issue of we're now seen as criminals was something that troubled him tremendously. And I have to tell you, I enrolled at City College some 16 years after the scandal. And if you're Jewish, we sometimes say about the destruction of Temple, Zecher l'Churban, remember the destruction. We still remember, the older guys still remembered what had happened to City College and how we went from being at the top of the elite, a moment of great joy for Jews and other ethnic groups, to being pilloried because of the scandal. And by the way, Adolph Rupp says, these gamblers, Jewish gamblers, they can't touch my boys with a 10-foot pole. 2 years later, there's a basketball scandal in Kentucky. So it's bigger than everybody else. So a bit of projection on my part, I agree, but it's something that should be said in terms of how Marty Glickman was our announcer, our New York announcer, and how this was so basic to his experience. So I hope I've come close to answering your question.
No, it's just it's a fascinating story that this happened to his father. First of all, again, we don't have him, really reflecting on this, but to have your father go to prison, and I could say more about all the different models of masculinity that to have your father, to be impoverished by your father who fails and go to prison and end up being a star athlete. It's quite...
Well, his father was a star athlete too. Back in Romania, he was a track man, and he raced against the mayor of the city, and he won the race, and they gave the trophy to the mayor's son, and they gave him 3 pennies, okay? His father, for what we know, not only had that criminal aspect. But one other thing I should note, when Marty is turned away in 1936, the Brooklyn Eagle, which was their newspaper, and by the way, the Brooklyn Eagle did not go overboard about the anti-Semitism, interviewed Marty's father, and Marty's father said, "How could they do this to my son? I want to speak out." But Mrs. Glickman, my wife, said, "Keep it low, keep it down low, keep it quiet." So it's multi-generational in terms of not confronting anti-Semitism, living your life, and trying to advance within the United States. We do know, according to Marty, that on the street, someone made an anti-Semitic remark to a friend of Glickman's father, and he punched him in the mouth. But that's easy. That's street violence as opposed to speaking out about anti-Semitism. So all these things, I hope I've made the point that this is not a sports book. This is a book about American Jewish history, and it rises over the shoulders of the Beth Wengers and the Deborah Moores and the Ron Bayers. So it's great to have a corpus of existing literature, and then you make your little bit of addition through my sports metaphor.
So somebody in the audience wants to know if Marty Glickman had a favorite New York baseball team.
Baseball team, no. His favorite, well, first of all, he did the original call-in sports stories, shows when he was working for the Brooklyn Dodgers, so he liked the Dodgers, being a Brooklyn guy, but he didn't do that much in terms of baseball, although his mentor was Red Barber, okay, who told him, don't speak so fast and tell stories, but of course basketball and football. His favorite team, I have to think, was the New York Giants. The New York Giants, okay? Pull off the road. I don't want to ruin this. He would do double headers. He'd do the Giants, and then he had a contract dispute with them and went to the Jets. But when he was in his heyday at the Giants, he did those games. He jumped on the subway and went down to Madison Square Garden to do the Knicks. And he would get ready for the broadcast by reciting poems from Edgar Allan Poe and Chaucer, just to get his voice together. So his favorite teams were not baseball, but basketball and football. He did a little bit of hockey. He also did, roller derby. So he did 2,000 games, and he did the Trotters at Yonkers Raceway. Very busy guy, that's for sure.
And I just want to ask a follow-up question. How much do you think that his thick New York dialect limited him on a national stage?
Well, you don't need me to say this. Back then, reporters for the New York Times and the Herald Tribune, the Vessies and the Jerry Ashkenazis, they all talked about the fact that he was too much of a New Yorker. And I found all sorts of sources that said towards the end of his life, he gets a chance to do the Rose Bowl. And the LA reporter says, he's great, even though he sounds very much like a New Yorker. So that was a limiting thing. But today, you have Mike and the Bad Dog. They talk like we talk. It's a very different type of business than it was back in the day. So I think that it limited him, but it also bespeaks what the appropriate type of voice is for American broadcasters. And again, Marty Glickman had to overcome that. And the good news is, since he didn't go national, we as kids and adults had the privilege of listening to him, I can't say 2,000 games, but so many times Marty Glickman was our guy. And he said in one of his memoirs, I was a New Yorker as a New Yorker could be. Oh, and one last thing, since this is the American Jewish Historical Society, and some of you happen to be of Jewish origin, he sometimes threw in Yiddish phrases to his broadcast, not only Meshuggah, but other types of phrases. So if you were a New York Jew, you were sort of proud that one of your guys he called himself a cultural Jew, had a strong sense of his culture as a Jew? And there's another question.
Another hot breaking off the press. No, finish your sentence. So.
I finished my sentence.
Finish your sentence. Okay, so I'm going to ask this. I'm going to ask this in two. There are a couple of questions here, so I'll split them up. So to what extent did Marty Glickman impact the future of other aspiring Jewish athletes?
Aspiring Jewish athletes?
Yeah. His influence on as being a Jewish athlete, what effect did that have?
I think regrettably, most Jewish athletes of the later generations were unaware of Marty Glickman's story. And one of the things that I hope to do in this book is to retell that 1936 story, for not only for athletes, but for others. And you know, Jewish athletes today have a much easier time with their Jewishness. I often say that, you know, I happen to be a professor at Yeshiva University. In the last couple of years, we've had a pretty good basketball team, you know. And they've gone Division III, and they've gone to the small big dance, that's the Division III championships. And a lot of people at my institution make a big deal about how good our basketball players are. But my sense as a historian is the most interesting thing about those games is that the first round takes place on Friday, not at 8 p.m., but at 12 noon. So our players don't have to violate the Sabbath. And if you think this is a Jewish story, it's not, because there's another university in this country that has a Y on its helmet. It's called Brigham Young. And they don't play on their Sabbath. So, look, we're living through a difficult time here for American Jews. No gainsaying that for a moment. But the fact of the matter is that in the sports world has been very tolerant to us. I sometimes say, no, I always say, my kids say I have 5 stories and I keep repeating them. But one of my 5 stories is that the NCAA has more rules than the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch in Hebrew. And yet within the thousands of rules, they say that if a team can't play because of religious reasons, we'll defer the game. Not because they love Jews, but it's a certain degree of tolerance. So contemporary Jewish athletes should know about Marty Glickman, and they should know how fortunate they are to live in a country which, for all the problems, and I'm not diminishing it for a moment, is far more tolerant of our generation of Jews than back then. And again, we had a purloined towel. If I had been a good athlete, I could have been a member of the New York Athletic Club.
So somebody wanted to know more about your father and wrestling. But I'm going to pick up, and you could address that if you want, but I'm going to pick up on a little version of the second question that I have in front of me. And you know, the book talks a lot about his impact on broadcasting, and which, you know, is really where he made his career. But do you, not just in terms of Jewish athletes playing the sport, but do you think he has a long-term impact on the kind of acceptance of Jews in the public sphere of sports or in other public spheres?
I think that more contemporary generations have benefited from the tolerance of America towards diverse types of voices doing the games. And by the way, I just want to mention that Marty Glickman was he did 2 things that people don't often note. First of all, he was one of the first male broadcasters to train a woman to do a NFL game. Her name was Gail Sirens. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was watching a game, and Beth Mowins,
yeah.
M-O-W-I-N-S, she was also one of his guys, so to speak. So as was Sal Marciano's daughter. So he had a consciousness, as far as that's concerned, that we could hear female voices. And the other thing about Glickman is that, ironically, the same guy who was marginalized at the end of his life, NBC turned to him and said, can you tutor the Bob Greaseys, the Frank Giffords, all these sports figures? And he was very willing to do that. And I wish he had said, but he didn't, but I'll say it for him, Sort of interesting. 1936. You don't emphasize the problems I faced. 1970, and later on with his broadcasting career, but now the world's changed. So I guess there's a feel-good aspect to this book that you might differ if you see anti-Semitism for what it is today as sadly very robust. But he lived in a different era. And sitting in this chair 2 weeks ago, I said the exact same thing. So you can check it out, because I said that at that conference as well, where you had Jews in the 30s looking around and seeing there was nobody there interested to support them. Very different era. With all the difficulties which we face today, if you're Jewish in this audience, scratch that. If you're an American in this audience, it's a very different time period.
Indeed. So I'm feeling like we're hitting that hour when we need to get Jeff out there. What? Oh, I have 2 minutes. Okay, so I get to ask one more. So I'm gonna ask about the moment, because we didn't really talk about this too much, about the moment in the beginning in the 80s. You say it's really a different American culture with the rise of Holocaust consciousness in particular that gives him this moment to speak out and to begin speaking out about his experience in 1936. So I'm going to ask 2 questions. I'm going to ask, one, was he immediately heard in that moment? I mean, you talked about the traveling exhibition, and that's when this has all gained momentum, and the Olympics came to be seen as kind of a pivotal moment, not the beginning of the Holocaust, by the way, but beginning of seeing Nazi Germany. So was he heard at the time? And how well known do you think the story of 1936 and what happened is in popular consciousness today? It's a 2-part question.
Well, in my jaundiced view, not enough. And I guess one of the reasons I did this book, it's generational. I talk to young people, and they've never heard of Glickman, they've never heard of 1936, and they also don't know 1972. So Marty, I'm also playing as a teacher here as far as that's concerned. I think the personal turning point moment for him takes place in 1985 when he's invited to go back to Berlin because they're doing a documentary on Jesse Owens' life. And he walks into the stadium, this big Olympic stadium. There were 80,000 empty seats. Those were the empty seats. And he looks up at the box where Adolf Hitler and Goering and Goebbels sat. And he has this moment. He says, you know what? I'm here and you're not here. And that is something, and he speaks so strongly now about Avery Brundage. You know what? I want people to know about 1936, and I want people to know about Avery Brundage, and I want people to know about racism and anti-Semitism in the Olympics, and I want all those things to come out of my book, even though I don't always explicitly mention it. So, Marty, I want to be a teacher like you were towards the end of your life.
Please join me in saying thank you.